if everyone is sitting comfortably. I think we will start. It's just after 7:15. Good, thank you. So, welcome everyone to this meeting of Local Plan Subcommittee. We have no members of the public here, but it is being webcast. It will be on the YouTube channel, so welcome to anyone who might be listening via that method. Apologies for absence. I have just two from Councillor Ritchie and Councillor Coleridge. Everyone else is here. Could I have any declarations of interest, please, from anybody? Councillor Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Declare a non-pecuniary interest as a member of Essex County Council and Cabinet member responsible for highways, which includes highways, sustainable transport and infrastructure, which includes parking, and obviously there is a reference to parking. I appreciate why it's wider policy. I just thought it would be appropriate to declare that. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't stay, Councillor Butland.
Can I declare a similar interest as a member of Essex County Council, and I am a member of the North East Parking Partnership, which again is probably remote, but just to get it on the record. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Right. Nobody else? No. All right. Minutes. Oh, sorry, Councillor Bowser.
Madam Chairman, only the fact that I'm a county councillor, but I've got no interest in the items that are on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Minutes of the previous meeting have been circulated. There are two. So the 5th of August, just to refresh memories, because it was a little while ago, we discussed Bradford Street Conservation Area, Braintree Town Centre Conservation Area, and the Norwich to Tilbury Grid Reinforcement Consultation. Could I have a mover and a seconder for those minutes, please?
Madam Chairman, you said the 5th, but it says a 3rd on our agenda.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault. It is the 3rd. I've
okay.
written down the 5th by mistake. Thank you
that's fine.
for correcting that.
Quite happy to move.
Yeah, thank you. And the seconder, thank you very much. And then the 21st of August, Rivenhall Waste Management Facility, Environment Information Report, and Wethersfield Conservation Area. If I could have a mover and seconder again. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Right. Just sign those.
Seem to agree those, Chairman.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Could I have a show of hands in agreement, please, for that? Small matter. Thank you very much. That I forgot.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Just before we move on to the main items, the Hatfield Peveril Neighbourhood Plan was on the agenda for that last meeting. The last meeting we should have had, which was cancelled because the weather was so awful. So that is not on the agenda tonight because that decision has been dealt with by myself under delegated authority. So it was a very straightforward item. So that's why it's not on here this evening. We have no speakers in public question time, so we'll move on to the main body of the event agenda, which is the Essex-wide parking standards consultation, something we haven't looked at for a long time. And that's going to be presented by Emma. Thank you, Emma.
Evening, members. So most of you are familiar with the Essex-wide parking standards. We use it to determine the need for parking spaces on all our new developments, and it continues to be referred to in the currently adopted plan as our source of parking standards. However, as Councillor Spray alluded to, the current standards date from September 2009, so a lot has changed in both national and local policy since then, but also the evolution of cars, electric vehicles, etc. So the Essex Planning Officers Association, which I'll refer to as EPOA throughout the rest of the presentation, have identified it as a priority to be updated, and have been working across the local planning authorities in Essex for almost 2 years on getting this document together. So we've been working across all the local planning authorities with an officer working group. Officers from Essex County Council, who are highways experts, have been incredibly crucial to that piece of work. and we've also had consultants called ITP who have also been helping and supporting with a lot of the evidence base and the accessibility work, which I'll come on to. At the same time as EPOA was talking about the main parking standards, there is an Essex Garden Communities group which had identified the need for bespoke parking standards across those garden communities being planned in Essex, but also across the largest developments across the county. And so, as you can see from the report, we've now got a sort of part 1 and part 2 to the standards, the part 1 being a more traditional replacement to the standards we currently have, and the part 2 being specifically around those largest developments and garden communities. So EPOA are currently asking for views and responses to the draft document in a consultation, which has been kindly hosted on behalf of EPOA by Essex County Council. So moving on to the Part 1 standards. So as I say, those are akin to the current adopted parking standards that we have. There are some main changes to the way that the document has been set out. So the first is that it has removed the maximum parking standards on commercial developments. At the moment we've had minimums on residential developments, but we have had maximums on commercial developments. And this is because the NPPF has changed since the last parking standards was produced, and the NPPF now says that maximum parking standards should only be set where there is a clear and compelling justification that they are necessary for managing the road network or optimising density. The work that we've done across Essex, we do not believe that those circumstances apply across most of Essex, but as we will go on to, there are some highly accessible locations in Essex which have been identified where we will look to apply a maximum. So that major change has been around accessibility really, and accessibility mapping across the whole of Essex. And if I just move on to that slide there so you can have a little look at it. So this is the map that has been produced across the whole of Essex. Obviously it's at quite small scale over there, but there have been 3 layers used in particular to make this map, which have been access to urban centres as a sort of proxy for access to facilities, within 10 minutes and 20 minutes walking distance, and within 10 minutes and 20 minutes cycling distance, and then also using the Essex public transport accessibility scores, which is essentially access to how close you are to bus stops, bus routes and train lines. So that gives you the sort of overview of Essex. You can see the legend there at the bottom, the colours grade from white, which is very low accessibility, all the way through to the darkest purple, which is very high. If I just move forward then, that is a close-up area of part of the district, not the whole of the district appreciated, but you'll see the 3 main towns, and Coggeshall and the rail line on there are where we start to score slightly more than that very low level. There are pockets then, if you see in the very darkest colours, in Braintree Town Centre, in Witham Town Centre, where we do then start to score in the high accessibility range. So what this means is that for most of the district, for residential development, we'll get one space. In a 1-bedroom house, you will get 1 space, and for 2-bedroom houses up, you will get 2 spaces, plus 1 space per 4 houses for unallocated visitor space. So this is the same as the current Essex parking standards that we're working to. There is a change in that those lowest accessibility areas, so those that are the first 2 grades of colours, there is a proposal that for the largest 4-bedroom plus houses, that they should have a minimum of 3 parking spaces per house. There are, as I've said, a very small pockets of the centre of the 3 towns where we are becoming going higher up in accessibility rates, and on those that score high or very high, and there are very, very few areas within the district that score that level, then the suggestion is that they are maximum standards and it is just 1 space per property, regardless of the size of the property, because they are accessible via a range of other methods and they're in the sort of main town centres. The document also makes the point that if you are looking to reduce that standard to that level, then we may ask developers to do a parking stress assessment to look at the around the development to make sure they're not putting undue stress on, that they may want to consider car clubs and making sure that there are appropriate controls in place for car parking. The other changes in this document are particularly around EV charging, the design of EV charging and the number of provision. and that matches with our policy in the local plan. We already were proposing a electric charging point for every residential dwelling, and so this just provides some more detail around the design and how that would be managed. Commercial development largely stays the same. What we're looking at there, so this is the residential development parking standards across the first one, so that's the one bedroom where they would get smaller. And then the cycle parking standards here you will see are broadly again the same as we've had at present. And then, as I say, for the commercial development, again, we're looking at, for car parking and cycle parking, we're looking at broadly the same levels as before, but we are looking at changing those from a maximum, as they currently are, to a minimum this time around. And that is a recognition that the evidence, if you restrict the number of spaces at a destination, it is not restricting it's not stopping car ownership. But what it is doing is causing problems on neighbouring streets and other things. So then we'll be looking at those minimum spaces on those commercial developments. Then we move to part 2 of the guidance. So this is the new part, which is about garden communities in particular, but it's also looking at developments of over 1,000 homes. So looking at those really large developments across Essex. This part of the standards has a more greater focus on when you're planning at scale, you can better plan for access with walking and cycling and public transport to facilities, so it may be possible to reduce car parking levels. So the guidance here produces a bespoke assessment for each of the larger scale developments, the starting point being how many spaces it would have under the Part 1 standard, so it wouldn't provide less than that. And then it goes through this metric which uses things like existing car ownership, average car ownership in the area, and modal share, accessibility, then the range of land uses and the distance to them on the new development, public transport improvements that may be coming, active mode improvements, etc. And you would score each of those categories on this chart to get an idea of a bespoke figure for parking on one of those major developments. It also consults on the idea of parking budget for the largest scale development. So this is, rather than each individual home or each individual property having to meet the parking requirements, it adds up the parking requirements across the whole development, and then it may put them in different places. So for example, the houses that come at the beginning of development when some of the public transport isn't there may have more parking spaces, and then developments that are near the public transport nodes or that come later when the public transport and facilities are there may have less parking spaces. So it's currently consulting on having an overall budget and then using it as it may be appropriate. So our draft response is included in Appendix 1 of your report. For Part 1, we're proposing to be broadly supportive of the principles contained within the document. We've got some suggestions for improvement around the mapping in particular. We think that needs to be interactive, and we do wonder whether the colouring is very clear, so we may need to look at that. Officers have made some sort of technical comments around the document itself. We're also looking at asking for more guidance on visitor cycle parking. So visitor cycle parking, even in the sort of smallest developments, is now proposed, and exactly how is that managed in the public realm of those smallest developments. So we're asking for more guidance on how we might accommodate that, and also making sure that we've got accessible size spaces, so those bigger spaces, if we've got a accessible bungalow, wheelchair accessible bungalow for example, they should also be accompanied by an accessible sized car parking space rather than a standard one. I guess the main concerns of officers probably relate to design guidance in the document. So when we started this process, we didn't have the LURB bill as yet, which has now become an act, and that bill requires all local planning authorities to produce a local design guide for their whole area. Now obviously we know that Essex is a wide and diverse area, and so the guidance that's within the document, some of the examples that have been given may be more or less urban and may be suitable to some parts of Essex rather than others. So our suggestion is perhaps that maybe there's some technical guidance on design within the document, but actually we may want to refer developers to authorities, local planning authorities' design guides for more detailed work and guidance and Braintree is currently working on its local design guide. In terms of section 2, again, I think we're broadly supportive of it. The likelihood is we will not use it in the short term. By the time this document is adopted, we will probably have granted permission for our remaining larger developments. So it'll have some time to bed in across the county. But we're supportive of the overall outcomes being achieved. But again, also noting that relationship between the document, national design guides, local design guides, and any specific design guides or policies that you might have around a bigger site, which is probably more usual on a site of that size. So the consultation on this document runs until the 4th of December, after which the consultants are going to analyse the responses received, and feedback will be given to the officer working group of LPA officers through the EPOA to consider it and move forward as appropriate. If we wanted to adopt this as an SPD, so to give it that level of weight, we will need to do a further consultation on it ourselves. The guidance to legislation is we have to do our own consultation. This is a joint consultation. So we will get the feedback, we'll look at it, and then if we want to take it forward as an SPD, it will come back to you in a final form for consultation at a Braintree level, and then adoption later on. So I think that was everything. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Emma. I think this is very timely to have this in. Parking is something that comes up regularly at planning committee, regardless of the size of developments that we're discussing. So I think the update is, very welcome at this time. Right, members. Yes, Councillor Walsh.
Thanks very much for the briefing, and it all sounds very timely and appropriate, and I appreciate what you said about Braintree's likely comments and the focus on EV charging points. There's a reference in paragraph 3.4, and my question is purely for clarification, and later, Emma, in relation to part 2, garden communities. And please don't read too much into this, it's just for clarification. Are there any garden communities being considered that might be within Braintree district, or this is just Essex-wide and there is nothing?
So this is the Essex-wide document, so it's come particularly from the Essex-wide garden communities group, so obviously garden communities in Chelmsford and places like that, so it wouldn't apply to any, we don't have any garden communities obviously in the district at the moment. It would apply to developments over 1,000 homes, and there are some of those in the local plan. But as I said, the likelihood is by the time this document goes through the process, those may well have planning permission anyway. So it will probably apply to perhaps a future round of allocations.
Yes, Councillor Abbott.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, lots of detail in there, and pleased to see that the maximum standards on commercial has been changed. I never really got my head around that. Why, to me, the first port of call should be a minimum, not a maximum. Yes. Perhaps we need both, but anyway, it's an improvement. I just wanted to ask about the accessibility map. Obviously, it's not a document that BDC's produced. It's very blocky and low resolution. Were you saying that only the top 1 or 2 of those shade gradings is the ones which apply to where the policy might apply on lower thresholds? Because I was just thinking if we tried to use that as it is, you could have debates about which colour block am I in.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. So it's definitely in our office of feedback that actually the grades of purple probably don't work, and we're better off with more clear borders, but also that we can have an interactive map on the website. So because you'll really want to zoom in to your development to work out which area it's in. So I know they do have that. I know it's a big file, so they need to work out a way of getting that on our website so that we can look at it. But yeah, certainly it's only the I think there might be 1 square in Braintree and a few more squares in Witham that trip into that sort of higher level, but it is very much just the town centres of those areas. It's not the whole towns. And hopefully that accessibility mapping made a bit easier will show that, but also making sure that it doesn't do anything else. It's an accessibility map for the purposes of parking. It's not an accessibility map for the purposes of anything else at this stage. It is just a parking map. So yeah, it's primarily very, very centre of the towns.
Thank you for that. And if I can, just one other thought that came to my head, having remembered what was on the map. Also, some of it looked a bit anomalous to me. So there seemed to be a long ribbon of relatively high colour through Kelvin and Fearing. I'm sure if the board members were here, they might raise that. Could you explain what that is about, including right out on the edge, some distance from the railway station?
Yeah, so we spent a long time with the consultants looking at the accessibility mapping and trialling a lot of different ways of mapping it. So at one point we had a map that showed the centre of Halstead being as accessible as the centre of Chelmsford, which obviously is not the case because bus routes after night time, the amount of facilities that were available, for example, because they both came up as sort of town centre locations, they came up very accessible. So it's taken us quite a while to work through the process. So I can ask the consultants for a particular look at which of the layers is showing up around the A12, because you're right, there is a string of higher accessibility along that A12 corridor. So I can certainly ask them which of the layers is particularly causing that increase there. I don't know off the top of my head, I'm afraid. The railway station will play a part in that, certainly, because of the 20-minute cycling to a public transport node. So that certainly will play a part within those maps. But yeah, I can certainly come back to you and ask because there'll need to be several factors that have gone into it to make it that higher level.
Right. Councillor Parker.
Yes, thank you. I was interested to note that you are intending, or the document is intending to have more parking spaces, possibly for houses with four bedrooms. I think the thing that I notice when I'm around and about is that there are now houses where there are obviously young people living at home with their parents, and they have 3 cars. And they need 3 cars because they need 3 cars. All of them are going to work in different directions. And so what happens is those people park, the 3rd car is on the street somewhere, and everybody complains about it. And the other issue I see when is quite a lot of sort of tradesmen, have quite large vans parked on their driveways. I just wonder whether the parking standards are taking into account of those issues. And another very sort of minor point, I was interested, you made a reference there to street trees, and I know that every so often we do get complaints, or I've heard complaints about tree sap falling on cars, and of course the solution is always to chop the tree down, So I just wonder whether it may not be appropriate in this document, but it may be better to pick up in a sort of landscaping document, but I know it is an issue. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly starting with that last one, I think that's one of our comments, that actually street trees are government policy now, so here to stay. So exactly how do we manage those two competing interests? Is there a certain distance that we should be, spaces should be away from street trees and vice versa? So that's something certainly that we've commented about, that would welcome some more guidance on that area within the document. So that's that one. In terms of the 3 spaces for the larger houses in those low accessibility areas, it's for exactly that reason why they've decided that actually it's better to have the 3 spaces there, so they're not overspilling onto the road. And the parking spaces themselves are relatively generous now. They're the same as they were in the 2009 one, but the 2009 one was quite a step up from the previous one. So they are reasonably generous spaces, so you should be able to get certainly a small to medium-sized van on those spaces as well. And we'll also, again, what we have now is we have the minimum for a garage space, so a garage has to be large. If you've got a small garage that can't fit a car in it, that doesn't count as one of your parking spaces. It's got to be large, and it also then has to have the extra storage available in it for bikes and other things as well. So that has been retained in this document.
Anyone else? Yes, Councillor Bowes-Flint.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On the street trees, I've lived and breathed that problem all my life. I think, and I've said this before at Planning Committee, you would have heard me say this, I think trees in streets are fantastic, but we should have the right tree at the right distance. And that's where we've gone wrong in many occasions, and obviously went wrong, seriously wrong, 50, 60 years ago. But they look lovely, and they improve the street scene so much. But getting the right trees is so important, and obviously the distance. But the specialists and consultants can work that out for us. But basically, the only time that we're not bothered by a certain tree is when the leaves are starting to grow on it. The rest of the year is an absolute nightmare, and the sap takes so much water, which again is not sustainable and friendly, to get it off before you can actually see where you're going to drive. So I think that is really important, to get the right species of trees.
Right trees, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Don't see any other. Don't see any other hands up at the moment. I don't know how strongly members feel about whether this should be adopted as a supplementary planning document. Personally, I think that would be a good thing. But so, Emma, what would be the process for? I mean, who decides whether it does become an SPD? Am I right in thinking that would be a decision to be taken later on after this first round is completed and we've evaluated that?
Yes, yeah. So what will happen is we'll get this consultation out. So we've sent it out to all our consultees, and as have all the local planning authorities in Essex. We'll look at it. We'll then get a final version that the officers are happy with, and then it will be up to this committee. Really, we can bring it back to this committee, and if you'd like to adopt it as SPD, we'll need to send it out to consultation again, because we have to do that ourselves. And then again, it would be your decision to. Well, it would be your decision to adopt it as an SPD.
Well, I think that's something we should certainly bear in mind. That's for a little further down the line. Right, I'm not seeing anybody else wanting to comment or ask a question. So the recommendation for this is on page 5, which is to approve the consultation response on behalf of the Council as set out in Appendix A. Could I have somebody to move that, please? Councillor Butler and a seconder. Councillor Parker, I think, just got in there first. And a show of hands then, if all those in favour. Thank you, members. That's unanimous. Good. Okay. Right, so move on to agenda item 6, which is the Biodiversity Net Gain Guidance Document. This was to be presented by Julia O'Hara, but she's not able to be with us this evening. So I think, Emma, you're taking this one, aren't you?
I am.
Right.
Sorry. As you'll remember, biodiversity net gain of 10% was introduced by government legislation in 2021, and it was due to come into force for major developments this month, and for minor developments in January next year was the original proposal. About a month ago, we heard that this date for major developments had been moved back to January next year, and the minor development implementation had already been moved back to April. So now we're looking at mandatory biodiversity net gain introduced in January for major development and April next year for minor development. And this is because the secondary legislation and guidance hadn't been released by government, and in fact still hasn't been released from government in its fullest sense, which made it difficult for the local planning authorities, as you can imagine, to get ready for the implementation of it. We're now expecting all the remaining guidance and legislation by the 30th of November, so within the next fortnight, but we have no confirmed date in January or in April for the implementation dates. So we don't know whether we'll be needing to implement this from the 1st or the 31st of January. And this, as I say, will be at the mandatory 10% level, which has been set by government. So in the absence of this guidance and the need to provide guidance and best practice to the developers, agents and applicants who are looking to put in planning applications, Members of the Biodiversity Net Gain Working Group, which is part of the local nature recovery strategy work, and members of the Essex Planning Officers Association, again, particularly those on the Planning Policy Group, have worked together to put a joint guidance document together, the intention of it being to be given as a template to each authority in Essex, who can then use it as guidance. So you'll see that this is really a baseline document, and as the further guidance is introduced, as we learn more best practice, and as the local nature recovery strategy is consulted on and brought forward, that will help the guidance. We'll put more information in the guidance, and eventually, either as a standalone document or as part of a wider document, we would like to adopt this as a formal SPD. But at this time, because we don't have the final legislation things from government, and because we wanted to make sure we had something out there and ready for the implementation date, we're suggesting that this is guidance in the first stage. So the guidance doesn't change the statutory policies that are set out in the local plan. The local plan document was before the implementation in the Environment Act of BNG, and therefore it is not particularly effusive at all on BNG. But so it doesn't. This document doesn't replace any of those policies around environment within the local plan. So the document that you'll have seen attached to the committee report provides an overall introduction to BNG. It talks about the legislation and the main principles of biodiversity net gain, and then how it could be secured, either on-site as a priority or off-site, ideally as close as possible. It provides guidance for developers and applicants on the process, on the good practice so far that we've learnt and what we want to see. And by using this template across Essex, we're hoping that local applicants and developers will be able to ensure a consistent approach across the whole of Essex. So if approved tonight, the presentation of the document will be improved and it will be placed on our website for use as a guidance document. You'll see the second recommendation is to allow myself to make some changes to the document as some of the more legislation and best practice comes out. But then once we've got all that legislation in place and we've implemented and we've learnt some lessons, then we will be coming back to you with a document that we'd then like to send out for consultation and again adopt as an SPD. So happy to take any questions on this one.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, Councillor Walsh, I think you got him first, then Councillor Abbott.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And my question, and it is a question, is partly based on a quick word with Councillor Abbott, who knows much more about this area than I do, and perhaps than some of us. I see the idea of 10% net gain, biodiversity net gain, and that sounds good. How is that 10% measured? Based on what, and what is included in the 10%? And then secondly, and this was the thing that we happened to touch on coming here together this evening, will the biodiversity net gain, is it required that it should always be on the site in question of any development, or can it be off-site? And if it's off-site, is it always going to be meaningful, or possibly even, and I don't really like the term greenwashing, but it's a shorthand. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So there is a very complicated biodiversity matrix which needs to be looked at. Any developer or applicant has to get a suitably qualified person, so usually an ecologist, to carry out that exercise. That exercise then comes to us. There's a very complex government spreadsheet, so a standard, and I can send the links out for those who are interested, which they have to fill everything in, and that will spit out an answer at the end in terms of the amount of space that you need to provide to go up by that minimum of 10%. Our preference is certainly for the 10% to be included on the site. That, interestingly, so at the BNG working group that we've had as part of the LNRS, we had a number of counties come in who were pilot areas on BNG, and they took completely different approaches. One of them had a absolutely on-site wherever possible. The other one actually said, well, in order to get the magnitude of space in corridors, for example, they had taken a more off-site approach. So I think there are equally valid options for both of them, but we're following the government guidance, which is on-site first, then off-site, and we'll be looking for that to be achieved as close as possible to the site. It will depend on what the habitat is that they're creating as to how close they can get it to the site. So they'll be looking at on-site, then off-site, and we've got a number of off-site providers already in the district who are offering it, landowners, farmers, got some very good schemes who are coming forward who will really make some real meaningful biodiversity increases from their schemes. And then the last resort is a scheme of last resort which Natural England are operating, which has set the price of their credits. So the spreadsheet will spit out a credit, and you have to have so many. You have to then achieve so many of those if you're looking at off-site. And the landowners are pricing up their credits based on how much they think it will cost them to develop and maintain that site for 30 years. That's the minimum they have to have it for. The further away from the development you are buying credits, the more credits you need. So that encourages developers to try and do things as close as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll always be in the district. So if you were looking at a development in Rain, for example, the closest site could be in Ottlesford. Similarly, if you were looking at something in Steeple Bumstead, the closest site could be in Suffolk. So they are looking at closeness in terms of distance rather than being actually in the district. But as I say, we've got some really good off-site schemes in several areas of the district, but on-site is the first preference, noting that will not always be able to be achieved on every site. Part of that is around the nature of the site, but also part of it is going to be the nature of the habitat that they'll be preparing. So if they need to produce a habitat which, for example, is not going to mix well with walkers or people walking their dogs and things, then actually you may prefer that to be off-site where it can happen without dogs and people trampling all over it. So that there's lots of factors that go into it, and that's all on the matrix.
Thanks, Emma. We did have an application to Planning Committee not all that long ago for it was Business Park in Witham, where a company wanted to expand their business, and it simply wasn't possible on the site to provide biodiversity net gain. I mean, there just wasn't any way to plant trees and hedges. It wouldn't have been appropriate anyway. So I know there was quite a lot of discussion about where that was going to take place off-site. So I think that was quite a good example of where sometimes you simply can't do it. Fine, thank you. Councillor Abbott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I could bore everyone tonight with hours on this subject, but I won't. Page 30 of the report says the UK has lost half of its biodiversity since 1975. And the latest audit, the organisations who are supposed to keep the government's task on this say the situation's not improving. And the reason the situation is not improving, apart from land use changes such as agriculture, is development. And I've been chronicling what's been happening in this district for many years. And I won't mince my words. We are overseeing catastrophic biodiversity loss on development sites. And simply saying, well, we're just going to have it somewhere else, as if it's sort of Lego bricks, you can move from one place to another, doesn't wash. I'm glad you raised, Madam Chairman, the case of North East Witham. As you know, I got a bit upset about it, but I think I was right to. Every single tree, every single yard of hedge on that site has been destroyed, including hedges which were 19th century parish boundary features. Now, they would have had very rich biodiversity. You're talking about old hawthorn and blackthorn trees and bushes, oak trees, gone, to be replaced by two enormous warehouses, no doubt floodlit with a few stick trees around the car parks. That is not biodiversity gain. And that has now gone through on the basis that the off-site hasn't even been agreed yet, as far as I'm aware. We couldn't even agree the off-site. But even worse than that, when the first version of that application came in, the applicants said they were keeping the hedges. So I don't understand why the district council officers didn't push back and say, well, no, we'll stick with that. We're not going to have an iteration which removes those. And on site after site after site, in the part of the district I know best, maybe it's different up in the north, but where I go round, the red line of the site is basically an area for developers to eviscerate the wildlife, and maybe some stuff around the edges might survive, and maybe a few trees in the centre might survive, but most of it's gone. And I've photographic evidence of that going back many, many years. So whilst I welcome the fact that we have this, I fear that it's not going to stop the losses. And I think until we can reach a position, and I do accept this needs national guidance, it's not something we as a district council can on our own, that says, no, you actually have to protect anything valuable on a development site. And if that means if you can't do that, you can't develop it, or at least you'll have to amend your development to accommodate for nature, then I'm afraid to say that the loss of nature is going to continue. And it particularly worries me about this idea of moving off-site maybe 10, 20, 30 miles away. Because, of course, we know where the development pressures are. They're on corridors such as the A12. Does that mean we're just going to see nature pushed further and further out from such corridors when actually we should be trying to protect it where it is? So I'll vote for this tonight because it's something, but I have to say I'm incredibly sceptical. As Councillor Bowers-Flint says, she's lived and breathed street trees. I've lived and breathed this issue on a hands-on way for 40 years, and I'm afraid to say it depresses me to see what we've lost. And if you go along the A12 corridor now, have a look at the trees that are there now and remember them because they're about to be all wiped away by the A12 widening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Abbott. I've had a couple of comments from members, I think Emma has two, around the 10% threshold that, you know, can we not ask for more, 20% for example. At the moment, Emma will correct me if I'm wrong, 10% is what we can demand. More than that, and I think it's actually in the report, 20% is what we would quite like to see, but I think that's got to wait for our next version of the local plan if that's what we want to do, to adopt that. And of course we are, as Emma said, still waiting for more government information anyway, but certainly our aim would be, you know, going forward to have more than 10%. Councillor Bowers-Flint, I think you're next, and then Councillor Parker and Councillor Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The one thing that I am, besides the other things, but the one thing that stands out that I'm really pleased to see in this report is at the bottom of page 57, and the acknowledgement of health and well-being and nature. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I think many of us would echo that. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got a few comments. Should I do them one by one? Is that easy?
Yes, please
So
do.
first of all, I know this is going to be a guidance document, but it is headed a supplementary planning document. I mean, should we just change the title for the moment, just to make that clear?
Yes, absolutely. Apologies, that should have been changed prior to it coming to committee. So it's been developed by the group so that it can be an SPD later on, but it needed to come off before this. So yes, that'll come off before it's published.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so you've answered my other question about I was going to ask who's going to be deciding whether it's going to be 10% or more, and that is going to come presumably back to us later. I mean, I do think one has to, like all these things, we've got to balance the desire to see additional provision for nature with cost. And one of the things that is concerning about this whole process is that it is actually going to apply if you want to build one house. And I think this is the government saying it's going to apply if you build one house. And so anybody who's wanting to build one house has now got to employ an ecologist and monitor for, I think, for 30 years. I mean, we are also meant to be encouraging in the country in particular, small developers. And it does concern me that this is getting very burdensome for small developers and small who are small businesses who employ local people. So I noticed that there is a special regime for. I mean, it's a bit sad really that the number is at 10 dwellings. I mean, you can have a development of 12 dwellings, which is going to have to provide an enormous amount of information, and at the end of the day, the person who's going to be buying that house will probably find that their house is £30,000 more expensive than it would have been, or something. You know, so it does concern me about whether we're getting that balance right for those smaller developments. So, I mean, I think there's not necessarily a great deal we can do about that. There is a specific sort of a different metric, isn't there, for smaller?
Yeah.
I haven't obviously looked at it, so I don't know quite what the level of burden is. But
Mo, would you like to come back on on that?
Yeah, so you're right. So I was going to mention there is a small sites metric as well as a larger sites metric. So the smaller sites metric is meant to be more straightforward and easier for those in recognition of some of those issues. But you're right, it is an extra. It is something extra for the developments to do and for the planning officers to look at. Obviously, the 10% is mandatory across the country, so that's government policy. So there's no viability argument that a developer can make. They need to do this regardless, so that will be taken forward. We are looking at, so the Local Nature Recovery Board, which is Essex-wide, has made a recommendation that we should be looking at 20% to encourage 20% BNG across Essex. And we're very grateful to have secured some money so that we can do a viability study of 20% BNG, so we can look at what the what the cost difference is to a developer between 10% and 20%, and then that can factor in the individual local plan viability studies as they come forward, so we can see the extra it may cost. There is a similar study that has been done in Kent, which actually shows that the difference between 10 and 20 is actually quite small, but obviously it will come to a choice in terms of when you get to a new local plan, you'll have all your policies laid out, you know, the affordable housing, the infrastructure, all those policies will be laid out for you, and we may need to make judgments in terms of making sure that development remains viable. But yeah, it is something extra that all developers and applicants will need to do, and something extra for planning committee to look at and for officers to look at. But I think the hope was by putting the small sites back to April, we get a bit of practice in with the major developments, and then the smaller developments can then learn from that and have a bit of extra time to sort of work themselves up to it.
Yes, you had another point.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes. So just on the applications that it applies to, obviously it applies to housing developments. Presumably it applies to employment sites of a certain size, presumably?
Yeah, so the same major and minor definitions. So yeah, major commercial developments, yeah.
And presumably solar farms and renewable energy, does that apply to that? What about change of use, if you're converting a barn or something?
So at the moment, it won't apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects. That has a target date for later, and I can't remember off the top of my head when it is, but it is, I think it might be the year after. It's quite a while after the implementation of major and minor developments. There are certainly exceptions. So householder applications, for example, you know, if you're building extensions and things, they wouldn't come in. I don't think change of use falls in either, but there is some guidance in the document which I'm just trying to scroll to.
Yeah, no, I did see that. Yeah.
April 2024.
Yeah, April 2024 for NZIPs. So they've got quite a while to come, which personally I think is a shame because they're some of the largest developments in the country, and I think if any they should be providing BNG. But
what about the non-NSIP solar farms, the ones that are 49.9 megawatts?
so if it's a major development, yes, then it's coming into the system from January. So.
Right.
Sorry, may I ask?
Yeah. Yes.
Just on that, I sort of was. I'm a bit unhappy that has been included right at the very end of this document. If I can find it, sorry. There's a reference to how this can be achieved, and I think there's a reference to renewable energy infrastructure as being, green infrastructure. And I find this sort of muddling up, actually, of things that are designed to create habitats and renewable energy infrastructure, which is really trying to address a different problem, not very helpful. And I personally would like to have that taken out, that paragraph. I'm sorry, I can't. I should have written down and noticed exactly where it is. Where was it? Yeah, you're right. Thanks, Councillor Baskin. It's page 59.
Where about which section on page 59? Sorry.
It's headed energy. Bottom paragraph.
It's 59.
Oh, sorry.
I've got it.
Oh, wait a minute. I know, because I think I'm on an old document, that's why. I'm on the previous version, which is why.
Page 58, yeah, wind and solar farms.
So I'm just checking that that isn't a copy from another document. It's not the green infrastructure example policy. I mean, if that is our writing, then happy to amend that. I'll just need to double check that it's not. That's not something. That whole piece isn't copied from another piece of work, but I don't think it is. So, yeah, happy to.
Madam Chairman, for those of us
Yes.
who haven't got this in front of us, because I don't work off a screen, can we be clear what we're changing? And also, I would presume it's a decision of the committee and not one person.
Yes. Shall I read? Do you want to read it out, Emma, or shall I read it out?
So I can read out the paragraph. So through the delivery of renewable energy schemes, there is also an opportunity to deliver BNG. Wind and solar farms in particular, if managed correctly, could be considered green infrastructure assets, delivering both energy and biodiversity enhancements along with other benefits. And then it goes on to talk about the other benefits in terms of cooling effects. And more information can be found in Essex's Green Infrastructure Strategy or the Design Guide. So,
Councillor Parker, you're suggesting that comes out?
Yes, I am, because I certainly, a solar farm and a renewable energy development would be counted as a major development, would be covered under the BNG, guidance anyway, and that you'd have to provide additional biodiversity gain for either of those developments. So I just don't see why. I just don't think it's necessary to have it in there, and it's sort of implying that there is a habitat benefit from a wind turbine itself and solar panel itself. But the actual biodiversity net gain thing is covered by the fact it's a major development.
So, I mean, you could have the sentence that says wind and solar farms in particular, if managed correctly, could deliver both energy and biodiversity enhancements. Would that be acceptable?
I'm not particularly comfortable with taking it out altogether. But
I'm happy to move appropriate compromise.
Yeah, I think Emma's suggestion is probably a better compromise. So Councillor Cummings moved that. Can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Abbott, and a show of hands, please. Does everybody? Yes, thank you. That we will amend that wording as said. Okay. Councillor Cunningham, I had you down next.
Thank you. Yes, just to say, I mean, I sympathise with the points made by Councillor Mrs. Parker. Her first points regarding size of development, and I think it's always getting that balance of locking in the high standard of sustainability and the quality of policy without being prohibitive to actually enabling homes to be built. And I appreciate that may not that may not be a popular sentiment, but I think it's a realistic one, and I think one we must never forget. I think on the whole this has been a really quality piece of work. and I think it really symbolises what can be done, particularly through the joint working of the Essex planners having our top planning talent across districts working to formulate quality policy, and the policy is inevitably going to be of a higher quality as a result. Therefore, Madam Chairman, I'm very happy to move the recommendations as set out on the report.
Thank you, Councillor Cunningham. Just before I ask for a seconder, Councillor Butland, you indicated to speak.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I suppose that on a seesaw, I'm probably somewhere in the middle on this. I'm not a zealot at one end or the other. So I don't argue that one should be able to speed along the A12 and not see any trees. Neither do I argue that one should be stationary on the A12 and look at all the trees. And I take the point that Councillor Bowers-Flint says that nature and green spaces has a positive impact on health and well-being, but also employment and housing has a positive impact on a person's well-being. And it's how one strikes the balance on this, which of course I think is always what basically elected members have to do. You know, I don't think you can come down one side or the other and say it's a black and white. It never is black and white. That's what makes it so much more difficult. So, as I say, I sit on the middle of this seesaw. But in terms of the recommendations, I did want to amend the recommendation because I think what this discussion has shown, and I think we all know, that this is something which is actually very political with a small p. It's not necessarily party political, because I think within different parties people have different views, etc. But in the recommendation, the second bit of the recommendation, when I can find it, which is on page
20.
20, right, thank you. I was going to suggest that delegation is given to the Head of Planning and Economic Growth. I would like to insert the words, in consultation with the appropriate portfolio holder stroke holders to agree changes. Because you know, there may be ones which actually would make it an invidious position for the Head of Planning and Economic Growth to make those decisions, him or herself, in this case at the moment it's Emma, without consulting with the elected members. So I would just add, in consultation with the appropriate portfolio holder or holders, because it wouldn't just be planning, it might be economic development, it may be other things like that. So I wish to propose that as an amendment.
I'm very happy for that amendment to be included.
Right, thank you, Councillor. Emma, does that
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, good. All right. So, Councillor Abbott.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Councillor Butland appeared to be responding to the comments I made about the A12. Two things. Firstly, I'm all too familiar with the problems of the A12 and have been, like many other people, stuck on the A12 for long periods of time and had complaints about people being stuck on the A12 for a very long time. But he also used the word zealot. Could I, through you, Madam Chairman, invite Councillor Butland to say whether that word was referencing me?
Madam Chairman, it's referencing people at both ends of the seesaw. I said I sit in the middle. I'm not a zealot who sits on either end of the seesaw.
Yes. Right.
Where people position themselves on that seesaw is a matter for them.
Right, understood. Thank you. Right, so the recommendation with the amendment has been moved by Councillor Cunningham. Could I have a seconder on that, please? Councillor Bowers-Flint. Could I please have a show of hands? Who is in agreement? It's unanimous. Thank you, members. Good. Good discussion on that one. Right, so now we can move on to item 7, which is Local Development Scheme Revision, which is going to be presented by Alan. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Sorry. So the Local Development Scheme, or LDS, is the project management document which sets out which supplementary planning documents and other documents the Council is intended to produce and the timetable for their production. The Council is required to keep this document up to date, and the last LDS was taken to this committee last November. The version of the LDS included at the appendix will replace the November 2022 version from last year. The main changes to the document are an update to the neighbourhood plan list to include, for example, the Finchleyfield and Wethersfield neighbourhood plan, and an update to the SPD estimated data of approval table at page 73 of the report. Work is continuing on all SPDs involving numerous parties, so it's not just the planning policy team working on our own on these. For example, we're working closely with the operations team on the waste SPD because this obviously directly impacts their work, and with the development management team on the design SPD as an example. To give an idea on the likely timescales, when we're looking at taking the design SPD, for example, we've got sort of just over a year for estimated completions. Just to say that we will be undertaking shortly some workshops with parish councils and other interested parties on the proposed contents of the SPD prior to consultation. And the local plan subcommittee we will be seeking approval from the local plan subcommittee to send that document out to public consultation. Right. It should be noted that document will be quite illustrative, quite heavy on the drawings, so it's going to take a little bit of time to get all those done. I mean, the waste SPD again, we are a little pessimistic on its delivery. There's obviously been a little bit of movement in terms of waste from government, so I think the December 2024 is a little bit pessimistic, so we are intending to get that to local plan subcommittee a lot quicker than December. And for the affordable housing SPD, majority of this document has been drafted. We're just waiting a little bit of information on Section 106 contributions. It's also worth noting that SPDs like this do require strategic environmental assessment, which has its own consultation period, so a pre-consultation period where we have to write to the environmental bodies and get the document screened, which can take up to 5 weeks. Although I do phone them up and beg them for a response quicker than 5 weeks, which usually works, but not always. So the Council's statement community involvement requires that SPD should be consulted for a 6-week period, so all of these will have 6 weeks. I think under the regulations, I think technically you only need to do 28 days, but obviously we have that policy locally to do it for longer. So, yes, I think that's all I have to say on the LDS, Councillor Sprague.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I mean, it's good to see the number of neighbourhood plans coming forward. There's a lot of activity around them, which is, which I think is encouraging. But also, as you said, there's some quite hefty pieces of work to be done. Affordable housing, open space, and so on. So quite a lot of work to do, and I know there is, there is a lot of work going on behind the scenes already on those. Councillor Cunningham.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Alan for that. A very good report, very good update, and I'm very happy to move. Thank you.
Right. Councillor Walsh, before I ask for a seconder.
It's a question, if I may.
Yes, carry on. Yep.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a very solid and impressive piece of work. I'm pleased to see, just to pick out one example and then a general reflection, I see there's a renewable energy locations SPD, and I assume that would include solar farms, where some of us have concerns about the number and the scale and them taking place on what is said to be arguably good quality agricultural land. But Alan, what else is included here apart from solar? And then my broad question is, this is genuinely impressive, and I'm not meaning to be patronising, it really is impressive. Are we confident we've got the staffing and management resource to meet these deadlines?
Just on your first point, so the renewable energy will also include wind generation as well as solar. In terms of resources, we are getting on with it. I think there are some of the SPDs we do need to get some external help in on For example, the Open Spaces SPD is a very specialised piece of work. I don't remember from, I think the last time we did that was in, I think, 2013, and it was, quite an interesting project at the time. There are specialist consultants who will need to get in to help us with that. The other documents, I think we, as and when we require professional advice, but from an officer level perspective, I think we are in a pretty good position with the team we have to actually get these done. And whilst we do try and write as much as we can, a lot of what we have to do is actually the administrative project management behind the scenes to make sure things get tended for and everything gets delivered on time. So it's, a lot of it is that as well. But I'm quietly confident. As I say, some of the dates are a bit pessimistic and some of them are maybe a little bit optimistic. But we're just trying to seek a balance between getting as much out as we can, hopefully before the government announces what we're supposed to be doing with the new local plans.
Yes, we await that with interest.
We do.
Thank you. Councillor Abbott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, that's perfect timing what the officer just said, because I was going to say, of course, if we get a change of government, not a political point, but if we get a change of government, it could all be up in the air again. Thinking of phrases like bulldozers to the planning system. I did read in there, I made a note here, I don't think it was in the officer presentation, about the local plan review 24 to 27. I have mentioned this to a couple of parish councils that, we have to, I think, sit within 5 years review. So presumably that's where those dates come from. But there were groans that we've got to go through the process again. One other thing, I can't resist the opportunity, so I'm going to use it. Silver End Conservation Area Guide. We're not meeting the timetable, Madam Chairman, that you gave me, myself and Councillor Wright. We're really, I've got one today I was dealing with, regular complaints from residents about how we get to a position where we get a reasonable, as other members have said, balance between competing interests, and in the village this is a real bone of contention. And then just finally, there's a typo in the timetables. It talks about the eternal lighting guide. I hope we're not going into biblical references here, so might need a change.
Right.
Get that corrected.
Okay, yes, we'll get that corrected. The Silver End Conservation Guide, unless Emma, and I appreciate she may not, has any update on that, I will get an update from Chris Padgett.
Yes, he was due to contact the Parish Council to get a meeting in the diary with them soonest, so I shall push him on making sure that date is going in.
I think we're all keen to see that happen for a number of reasons. Okay, good. Right, Councillor Parker.
Yes, can I just ask why the Renewable Energy Locations SPD, which is presumably that's because the government had said that every local plan should allocate land or state where renewable energy should go, and it doesn't currently in our current local plan. Why is it as a separate SPD and not in the document climate change? Is it because it's an SPD and the climate change document is, I'm not quite sure what sort of document that is actually, what's the sort of formal status of that document?
So originally when we were looking at a renewable energy document, the guidance from the inspector was that it had to be a development plan document because you could only allocate sites for wind turbines, for example, within a development plan document. So that's something that would need to be examined in the same way that a local plan is examined. So, but there have been very recent changes to policy on that, which has changed that. So it stood as a separate document because it was going to be a DPD rather than an SPD. I think when we are looking closely at the two documents, we'll decide whether they should be a single document or two documents, but we've left them as two documents for the time being. Sort of depends probably on the climate change document is quite well advanced. And the renewable energy locations one isn't, and we wouldn't want to slow the climate change one down for the renewable energy one. So that's So they're in as two documents at the moment, and the biodiversity net gain is in as a separate document as well, but it may be that we combine some of them into a single SPD.
And just as a I'm presuming there would have to be a lot of consultation with the residents over locations. I mean, I think it's...
Yes, and we'll need to get specialist consultants in on that one. And obviously it's a new area as the government has changed everything very, very recently. It's a new area for us, so there's no previous template that we can look at, so it's something that we'll need expert advice on.
Don't see any other hands up. So the recommendation, which is on page 61, has been moved by Councillor Cunningham. I don't think I had a seconder. Councillor Bowles-Flint, thank you. Can I have a show of hands, please? Yep. Thank you very much, members. That's unanimous. Good. So that finishes the main items of the agenda. We have no urgent business, public or private session, so I can therefore close the meeting at about 8:27, I think. Thank you very much indeed.